I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw the bright orange violation notice flapping against my windshield like some kind of aggressive butterfly. My name is Walter Northrop, and I had just gotten back from the VA hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, where I'd spent the better part of the morning getting my prosthetic leg adjusted. The drive from the hospital to my home in Sunset Ridge, a planned community on the outskirts of Scottsdale, usually gave me time to decompress, but today, my knee was aching something fierce. The phantom pain that doctors love to remind me was all in my head felt pretty damn real as I limped toward my front door, the violation notice crumpled in my fist. I didn't even need to open it to know what it said. The Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association had been on my case for 3 weeks now, ever since I'd started parking in the guest spot closest to my unit. The thing was, I owned a ground-floor condo specifically because stairs were a nightmare with my prosthetic, and the assigned parking spot for my unit was a solid 100 yards away across uneven pavement. The guest spot was 15 feet from my door. After my injury in Afghanistan, where an IED had turned my life upside down along with the Humvee I'd been riding in, I'd learned to pick my battles. But this one, I wasn't going to let slide. I unfolded the notice. Sure enough, there it was. A $200 fine for unauthorized use of guest parking, with a threat that my vehicle would be towed if I continued to violate community guidelines. The letter was signed by Brenda Patterson, the HOA president, a woman I'd had the displeasure of meeting exactly once at a community barbecue, where she'd spent 20 minutes lecturing me about the proper shade of beige for window treatments. I pulled out my phone and called the management office. A chipper voice answered on the third ring. "Sunset Ridge HOA, this is Jessica speaking. How may I help you today? This is Walter Northrop from Unit 147. I need to speak with someone about this parking violation I just received." "Oh, Mr. Northrop." The chipperness evaporated. "Yes, we've been trying to reach you about your repeated violations. The guest parking is for guests only, as clearly stated in the CC and Articus you signed when you purchased your property." "I understand that," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I'm a disabled veteran. I have a prosthetic leg and a handicap placard. The walk from my assigned spot is too far and too difficult for me to manage safely, especially when I'm coming back from medical appointments. I'm sorry to hear about your condition, Mr. Northrop, but the rules apply to all residents equally. If you require accessible parking, you should have requested a reasonable accommodation in writing before beginning to park in unauthorized areas." I felt heat rising in my chest. I shouldn't need to request permission to park near my own home when I'm physically disabled. That's what the Americans with Disabilities Act is for. Sir, the ADA applies to public accommodations. This is private property governed by the HOA. You agreed to follow our rules when you moved in. Let me speak to Brenda Patterson. Mrs. Patterson is unavailable at the moment. However, I can schedule you for the next board meeting on the 15th of next month if you'd like to formally request an accommodation. The 15th? That's 3 weeks away. What am I supposed to do in the meantime? Park in your assigned space, Mr. Northrop. Any further violations will result in towing at your expense. Have a nice day." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my living room, staring at the phone, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt. 3 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and more shrapnel in my leg than I cared to count. And I was being told I couldn't park near my own front door by some petty tyrant with nothing better to do than measure the height of people's mailbox posts. I called my buddy Marcus Chen, a guy I'd served with who now worked as a paralegal in downtown Phoenix. He answered on the first ring. "Walt, what's up, man? I need some legal advice. The HOA is fining me for parking in a guest spot because my assigned space is too far from my door. I'm pretty sure this is discrimination, but they're claiming their rules trump the ADA." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "They're partially right. HOAs do have broad authority over their properties, but the Fair Housing Act requires them to make reasonable accommodations for disabled residents. You can't just ignore their process entirely, but they also can't just ignore your disability. You got your discharge papers and medical documentation?" "Yeah, all of it." "Good. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to write them a formal letter requesting a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. Be specific, be polite, and include your medical documentation. Send it certified mail so they can't claim they never got it. They legally have to respond and work with you. And if they don't, then you file a complaint with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Trust me, HOAs hate federal investigations more than they hate people parking in the wrong spots." I thanked Marcus and got to work. It took me 2 hours to draft the letter, going through multiple versions until I had something that was professional but firm. I explained my service history, my disability, the medical necessity of parking closer to my unit, and formally requested that I be permitted to use the guest spot nearest my door as a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. I attached copies of my VA disability rating, my handicap placard, and a letter from my doctor at the VA explaining the physical limitations caused by my prosthetic leg. The next morning, I drove to the post office and sent the whole package certified mail with return receipt requested. The postal clerk, an older woman with kind eyes, thanked me for my service when she saw the VA letterhead. It was a small moment of humanity in what was becoming an increasingly absurd situation. For 2 days, I parked in my assigned spot, struggling across the parking lot each time, my leg aching with every step. On the 3rd day, I woke up to find my car gone. I stood in the guest parking spot where I'd left my vehicle the night before, my phone already dialing the non-emergency police line. It took 20 minutes and 3 different departments before I confirmed that yes, my car had been towed by Desert Eagle Towing at the request of the Sunset Ridge HOA. The towing company wanted $350 for the release of my vehicle, plus a $50 per day storage fee. I was so angry I could barely see straight as I called an Uber to take me to the impound lot on the industrial edge of Phoenix. The driver, a college kid who kept up a steady stream of chatter about his business classes, dropped me at a chain-link compound that looked like something out of a prison movie. Inside a dingy office that smelled like stale coffee and motor oil, a board attendant pushed a clipboard toward me. "Sign here, here, and here. Cash or card. You towed a disabled veteran's vehicle from a residential parking spot. You understand that's probably illegal, right?" He shrugged. "We just do what the HOA tells us to do, man. You got a problem, take it up with them." I paid with my credit card, each swipe of the machine feeling like a small defeat. My car was in the back lot, wedged between a banged-up sedan and a pickup truck with a shattered windshield. I did a quick inspection, found no damage, and drove back to Sunset Ridge with my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles white. I parked in my assigned spot and made the long, painful walk to my unit. Once inside, I called Marcus again. "They towed your car." "Before responding to your accommodation request. Oh man, they really screwed up. What do I do? File the HUD complaint today. Right now. This isn't just denying an accommodation anymore, this is retaliation. That's a separate violation. I'm sending you the link to the online complaint form. Fill it out, be detailed. Include everything, all the dates, all the communication, the towing, all of it. I spent the rest of the afternoon filling out the form on HUD's website. It was extensive, asking for details about the property, the HOA, the specific discriminatory actions, and the harm I'd suffered as a result. I included every piece of documentation I had, uploaded photos of the parking layout showing the distance from my assigned spot to my unit versus the guest spot, and wrote a detailed timeline of events. When I hit submit, I felt something like relief wash over me. This was out of my hands now. The federal government would investigate, and maybe, just maybe, the HOA would learn that they couldn't just steamroll over people's rights. I was wrong about it being out of my hands, though. The next morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Northrop. This is Sharon Valdez from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I'm calling about the complaint you filed yesterday regarding the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. My heart started beating faster. That was fast. Your case raised some red flags in our initial review. Towing a disabled veteran's vehicle after receiving a formal accommodation request is serious. We're opening an investigation immediately. I'm going to need you to walk me through everything that's happened, and I'll need copies of all your documentation. We spent 40 minutes on the phone. Sharon was thorough, professional, and took notes on everything. She explained that HUD would send an official notice of investigation to the HOA within a few days, and that they were prohibited from retaliating against me in any way during the investigation. What happens if they do retaliate? I asked. Then they'll be in even more trouble than they already are. Mr. Northrop, between you and me, this is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen in a while. The Fair Housing Act doesn't mess around when it comes to disability discrimination, and the fact that you're a veteran is going to make this an even higher priority for our office. Sit tight, document everything, and call me immediately if anything else happens. I thanked her and hung up, feeling something like hope for the first time in weeks. But I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. People like Brenda Patterson didn't like being challenged, and they definitely didn't like being investigated by federal agencies. I was proven right 2 days later when I found a notice taped to my door. It was a summons to an emergency board meeting, scheduled for that evening at 7 p.m. The notice claimed I was being called before the board for repeated and flagrant violations of community guidelines and failure to maintain proper decorum with HOA staff. I showed up at the community center at 6:55, my documentation folder under my arm. The community center was a bland stucco building near the entrance to Sunset Ridge, with a multi-purpose room that hosted everything from yoga classes to HOA kangaroo courts. The board was already seated when I walked in. Brenda Patterson in the center, flanked by 4 other board members I vaguely recognized from seeing around the complex. Brenda was exactly what you'd expect from an HOA president. A woman in her mid-50s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut and the kind of pursed lips that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons for the better part of her life. "Mr. Northrop," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Thank you for joining us. We need to discuss your ongoing violations and your recent harassment of our management staff." Harassment? I stayed standing. I called to dispute an unfair parking violation. That's not harassment, that's my right as a homeowner. You raised your voice to our property manager and made threats about legal action. That's harassment. Furthermore, you have continued to violate our parking policies despite repeated warnings. "I'm disabled," I said, keeping my voice level. "I have a prosthetic leg." I requested a reasonable accommodation under federal law. Instead of granting it, you towed my car. One of the other board members, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "Mr. Northrop, we sympathize with your situation, we really do, but rules are rules. If we make exceptions for one person, everyone will want special treatment. It's not special treatment, it's a legal right. The Fair Housing Act requires you to make reasonable accommodations for disabled residents." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "We received your letter, Mr. Northrop, along with your rather dramatic collection of documentation. The board has reviewed your request, and we're denying it." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that approving your request would fundamentally alter the nature of our parking system and create an unfair advantage for you over other residents. The guest parking spots are a limited resource that must be available for actual guests. Your assigned parking space is perfectly adequate." "Adequate? It's 100 yards away across uneven pavement. I'm a disabled veteran with a prosthetic leg. That's not adequate, that's discriminatory." Brenda stood up, her face flushing. "Don't you dare play the veteran card with me, Mr. Northrop. My father served in Vietnam. Service doesn't give you the right to ignore rules that everyone else has to follow. This isn't about ignoring rules. This is about basic human decency and federal law. Federal law doesn't apply here. This is private property governed by our CC and Articus. You signed a contract when you bought your unit agreeing to follow our rules. If you don't like it, you're free to sell your property and move somewhere else." I pulled out my phone. "This entire meeting is retaliation for filing a civil rights complaint. You know that, right? HUD is already investigating you." The room went silent. The other board members exchanged glances. Brenda's face went from red to white. "You did what?" "I filed a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They called me yesterday to let me know they are opening an investigation into disability discrimination and retaliation by this HOA." Brenda slammed her hand on the table. "You had no right to do that. We're trying to work with you." "No, you're not. You denied my accommodation request before you even received it, towed my car, and hauled me in front of the board to intimidate me. That's textbook retaliation." The man with glasses cleared his throat. "Brenda, maybe we should table this discussion and consult with our attorney." "We don't need an attorney," Brenda snapped. "We need residents who follow the rules instead of running to the government every time they don't get their way." "I didn't run to the government. I tried to work with you. You're the ones who escalated this by towing my car." Another board member, a woman in her 60s with carefully styled gray hair, spoke up. "Mr. Northrop, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot here. What if we revisit your accommodation request? I'm sure we can find a compromise." "The compromise is that you let me park in the guest spot nearest my unit because I'm physically disabled, and it's my legal right under the Fair Housing Act. That's not a compromise. That's the bare minimum of what you're required to do." Brenda gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. "This meeting is over. The board's decision stands. Any further parking violations will result in additional fines and towing. You're dismissed, Mr. Northrop." I left the community center shaking with anger and adrenaline. The moment I got home, I called Sharon Valdez and left a detailed voicemail about the meeting. She called me back within an hour. "They held a board meeting to deny your accommodation request and threaten you after you filed a complaint with us. That's exactly what happened." "Okay, this just went from bad to worse for them. I'm escalating this to my supervisor. We're going to expedite the investigation. In the meantime, I want you to park wherever you need to park for your safety and health. If they tow you again, call me immediately and call the police to report theft of your vehicle." "Can I really do that, Mr. Northrop? You have a legal right to reasonable accommodation. They're violating federal law. Yes, you can park in that guest spot, and yes, if they tow you, it's illegal. Document everything, save every email, every notice, every interaction. This is going to trial if they don't back down. Over the next week, I parked in the guest spot every single day. Every morning, I woke up expecting to find my car gone or another violation notice. Instead, there was nothing. Radio silence from the HOA. I should have known it was the calm before the storm. On day 8, I came home from a physical therapy appointment to find a notice posted on the community bulletin board and taped to every single unit door in the complex. It was a new parking policy, effective immediately. All guest parking spots now required a guest parking pass obtained from the management office with 72 hours advance notice. Any vehicle in a guest spot without a valid pass would be towed. I read the notice 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each word. This was targeted directly at me. They couldn't tow me for parking in the guest spot as a disabled resident, so they'd changed the rules to require advance permission that they could deny at will. I called Marcus. Can they do this? It's shady as hell, but probably technically legal. They can change parking policies. The question is whether refusing to give you a pass would be discrimination. You'd have to request a pass and see what happens. I went to the management office the next morning. Jessica, the property manager, looked uncomfortable when I walked in. "Mr. Northrop, what can I help you with?" "I need a guest parking pass for the spot near my unit." "Guest passes are for guests only, not residents. I'm a disabled resident requesting accommodation to park in that spot." "I need the pass to park there legally under your new policy." She bit her lip. "I'll need to check with the board. The Fair Housing Act requires reasonable accommodation, requiring me to get permission 72 hours in advance to park near my own home isn't reasonable." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Northrop, but I have to follow the board's direction. Let me talk to them and I'll get back to you." I never heard back from her. Instead, 3 days later, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Phoenix. Stephenson and Associates, representing the Sunset Ridge HOA. The letter was 6 pages of legalese that boiled down to a simple message. Stop parking in guest spots, stop harassing the board and staff, or face legal action for breach of contract and potential eviction proceedings. I forwarded the entire letter to Sharon Valdez. She called me back within 2 hours and she sounded angry. "They lawyered up and threatened you with eviction, while under federal investigation for disability discrimination. Either their attorney is incompetent or they didn't tell him about the HUD complaint." "What do I do?" "Nothing. Don't respond to them directly. I'm sending them an official letter today informing them that threatening a complainant during an active civil rights investigation is illegal retaliation and will be added to our investigation. In fact, I'm going to recommend that we refer this to the Department of Justice. This has gone way beyond a simple accommodation dispute. The Department of Justice, the DOJ, handles pattern and practice cases of civil rights violations. What your HOA is doing, threatening eviction, changing policies to target you specifically, all while ignoring federal accommodation requirements, that's the kind of systemic discrimination they take very seriously." My head was spinning. All I'd wanted was to park near my front door. Now I had HUD investigating, the DOJ potentially getting involved, and an HOA that seemed determined to die on this hill rather than admit they were wrong. The following Tuesday, I received a call from a Phoenix number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, tired of the constant barrage of legal threats and HOA nonsense, but something made me pick up. "Mr. Northrop, This is James Martinez with the Phoenix office of the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. I'm calling about your situation with the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. I sat down heavily on my couch. The DOJ is really involved now. Yes, sir. HUD referred your case to us given the severity and pattern of retaliatory behavior. We've reviewed the documentation you provided to HUD, and we've done some preliminary investigation. I need to ask you some questions. We talked for over an hour. James wanted to know everything. When I'd first requested the accommodation, every interaction with the board, the towing, the threatening letter, all of it. He was particularly interested in the timing of the new parking policy and the eviction threat. Mr. Northrop, I want to be clear about something. What the HOA is doing isn't just civil rights violations, it's potentially criminal. Threatening eviction in retaliation for filing a civil rights complaint is a federal crime under Title 18. The intentional denial of rights under color of law, in this case the HOA's authority, that's another potential criminal violation. Are you saying they could face criminal charges? That's not my decision to make, but yes, it's possible. For now, we're focused on the civil rights aspect. I'm going to be sending them a letter demanding immediate cessation of all retaliatory actions, including the eviction threat and the targeted parking policy. We're also going to require them to grant your accommodation request immediately. You can force them to do that. The Department of Justice has broad authority to enforce civil rights laws. If they refuse to comply, we can seek a court order. Most HOAs back down once they realize how serious this is. The penalties for violating federal civil rights laws are severe, both financially and in terms of oversight. No HOA wants to operate under a federal consent decree. That night, I barely slept. Part of me felt vindicated that the government was taking this seriously. Another part of me felt exhausted by the whole thing. I'd moved to Sunset Ridge to have a quiet place to recover and rebuild my life after everything that had happened in Afghanistan and during my long rehabilitation. Instead, I was in the middle of a federal civil rights investigation. The next morning, I was drinking coffee when I heard raised voices outside. I looked out my window to see Brenda Patterson in the parking lot, gesturing angrily at a man in a dark suit who was calmly taking notes. Two other people in suits stood nearby, one of them taking photographs of the parking layout. My phone rang. It was Sharon Valdez. Mr. Northrop, HUD investigators are at your property right now conducting a site inspection. The DOJ also sent someone. You might see some activity. I'm watching it happen right now. Brenda Patterson looks like she's about to have a stroke. Good. Maybe it'll convince her to take this seriously. The investigators are going to want to talk to you and potentially some of your neighbors. Will you be available? Absolutely. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on my door. The man in the suit introduced himself as David Chen, a HUD investigator. He was thorough and professional, photographing the distance from my unit to my assigned parking spot, then to the guest spot I'd been using. He measured the slope of the pavement, noted the uneven surfaces and cracks that made walking difficult with a prosthetic. Mr. Northrop, just so you know, this is one of the clearer cases I've worked. The accommodation you requested is textbook reasonable. The parking spot is available. Granting you access doesn't impose an undue burden on the HOA, and your disability clearly necessitates closer parking. Their denial and subsequent retaliation are violations of federal law. What happens now? We finish our investigation, compile our findings, and issue a determination. Given the evidence and the Dodge's involvement, I'd expect a finding of discrimination. At that point, The HOA can either settle and agree to policy changes, or we can refer it for litigation. Most settle. After David left, I watched through my window as the investigators talked to several of my neighbors. I saw Mrs. Chen from Unit 152, an elderly woman who often struggled with her own mobility, speaking animatedly and pointing at the parking lot. I saw the Johnsons from Unit 143 nodding and gesturing. Whatever they were saying, the investigators were taking detailed notes. That evening, I found a handwritten note slipped under my door. It was from Mrs. Chen. "Mr. Northrop, I told those investigators that the HOA has been awful to anyone who needs help. When my husband had his hip replacement last year, they fined us for having a temporary wheelchair ramp. They made us take it down. I hope you win. Someone needs to stand up to them. Dorothy Chen." I felt a surge of emotion reading her words. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person in this community who'd been bullied or marginalized by an HOA more concerned with arbitrary rules than people's well-being. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Then, exactly 1 week after the investigators had visited, I received a call from an unknown number with a Phoenix area code. "Mr. Northrop. This is Richard Stephenson from Stephenson and Associates. I represent the Sunset Ridge HOA." I tensed. "I'm aware. You sent me a letter threatening eviction." "Yes, about that. I need to be candid with you, Mr. Northrop. When the HOA retained my firm, they didn't disclose the full scope of the situation. I wasn't aware of your disability, your accommodation request, or the federal investigations until the DOJ contacted my office yesterday. And I've advised my client that their position is legally indefensible and potentially criminal. I'm calling to see if you'd be willing to discuss a settlement." "What kind of settlement?" "The HOA is prepared to grant your accommodation request immediately. You'll be assigned the guest spot nearest your unit as your permanent parking space. We'll refund all fines and towing fees you've incurred. We'll rescind the eviction threat and remove it from all records, and we'll agree to undergo training on Fair Housing Act compliance. In exchange for you withdrawing your HUD and DOJ complaints and signing a mutual release." I was quiet for a moment. Part of me wanted to take the deal. It would give me what I needed and end this nightmare. But another part of me thought about Dorothy Chen's note, about every other person who might face this same abuse in the future. "No," I said, "Mr. Northrop, I understand you're angry, but this is a good offer. If this goes to litigation, it could take years. I don't care. Your client didn't just deny my accommodation request. They retaliated against me for asserting my civil rights. They threatened to evict a disabled veteran for asking to park near his own front door. They changed policies specifically to target me. They need to face consequences, not just write a check and pretend it never happened. What do you want?" "I want HUD and the DOJ to complete their investigations. I want findings of discrimination and retaliation on the record. I want a consent decree that prevents them from doing this to anyone else. And I want Brenda Patterson removed from the board." Stephenson was quiet for a long moment. "I'll relay your position to my client. But Mr. Northrop, I have to warn you, if you push this to litigation, they're going to fight. It's going to get ugly. It's already ugly. The difference is now the federal government is watching." He hung up. I immediately called Sharon Valdez and told her about the settlement offer. "You turned it down," she sounded surprised. "Was that wrong?" "No, it's your right. But Mr. Northrop, I have to ask, what's your goal here? Do you want compensation, policy changes, what?" "I want to make sure they can't do this to anyone else. I want systemic changes, oversight, accountability. This isn't about me anymore." "Okay. That's actually helpful to know. The DOJ was planning to push for a consent decree anyway. Your refusal to settle privately actually strengthens our hand, but I want you to be prepared. This might take months, and the HOA is going to make your life difficult in the meantime. She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 separate violation notices for minor infractions. My trash can was visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. My doormat was the wrong color, and I'd failed to trim a plant on my patio that was allegedly exceeding the permitted height for vegetation. Each violation came with a $100 fine. Each violation was photographed and documented, and each violation was sent immediately to Sharon Valdez and James Martinez as evidence of ongoing retaliation. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in late August. I woke up to find my car blocked in by an HOA maintenance truck. When I went outside to ask them to move it, the maintenance supervisor, a guy named Rick who I'd always gotten along with, looked embarrassed. "Sorry, Mr. Northrop. Brenda told me to park here while we're working on the landscaping." "The landscaping is 50 feet away. You blocked me in." "I know, man. I'm sorry. She said if I didn't do it, she'd fire me." I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and called the non-emergency police line. If they wanted to play games, I was done playing nice. The Scottsdale police officer who responded was a young guy named Officer Williams. I explained the situation, showed him the parking layout, showed him my disability placard, and explained about the ongoing federal investigation. "So your HOA is deliberately blocking your vehicle in retaliation for a civil rights complaint?" "That's exactly what's happening." Officer Williams walked over to the maintenance truck and knocked on the window. Rick rolled it down, looking nervous. "Sir, can you move this vehicle? You're blocking this resident's access. My boss told me to park here. I'm telling you to move. Now." Rick moved the truck. Officer Williams came back to me and handed me a card. "Mr. Northrop, I'm going to file a report about this incident. If it happens again, call 911 and report it as harassment. What this HOA is doing to you is wrong, and I'm going to make sure there's a record of it." I thanked him and watched as he drove away. Rick approached me, looking miserable. "Look, man, I'm really sorry. I need this job, but I don't like being used to mess with people, especially not a veteran." "It's not your fault, Rick, but you might want to start looking for another job. This HOA is going down." That afternoon, I forwarded the police report to Sharon and James. James called me back within an hour. "Mr. Northrop, we've completed our investigation. I'm going to be straight with you. We have enough evidence to refer this for criminal prosecution. The blocking of your vehicle could be considered false imprisonment. The pattern of retaliation rises to the level of conspiracy to violate civil rights. The question is whether you want us to pursue criminal charges or focus on the civil remedies." My hands were shaking. People could go to jail. Brenda Patterson could potentially face federal charges, yes. So could any board members who participated in the retaliatory actions. But I need you to understand what that means. A criminal case is different from a civil rights action. It's more invasive, more stressful, and there's no guarantee of conviction. What would the civil remedy look like? We'd seek a consent decree requiring the HOA to adopt specific fair housing policies, undergo regular training, submit to federal oversight for a period of years, pay damages to you, and pay a civil penalty. We'd also likely require changes to the board structure to prevent this from happening again. "Do both," I said. "I want the consent decree, and I want you to refer the criminal stuff to prosecutors. What Brenda Patterson did was deliberate and malicious. She needs to face real consequences." "All right. I'll make the referral. Be prepared for things to escalate." Things escalated faster than I expected. 2 days later, FBI agents showed up at Sunset Ridge to interview Brenda Patterson and the other board members. I watched from my window as Brenda was escorted from the community center to a dark sedan, her face pale and her hands shaking. The community was in chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some people thought there was financial fraud. Others thought it was about discrimination. A few people knew the truth and started approaching me to share their own horror stories about the HOA. Mrs. Chen from Unit 152 told me about being fined $5,000 over 2 years for various minor violations after her husband became disabled. The Rodriguez family from Unit 138 told me they'd been threatened with eviction when they installed grab bars in their bathroom for their elderly mother without prior HOA approval, even though modifications for accessibility were supposed to be exempt from approval requirements. I started collecting their stories and forwarding them to Sharon and James. What had started as my individual case was revealing a pattern of systemic discrimination and abuse. On September 15th, exactly 2 months after I'd first filed my HUD complaint, I received a formal letter from the Department of Justice. They had completed their investigation and found that the Sunset Ridge HOA had engaged in a pattern and practice of disability discrimination and retaliation in violation of the Fair Housing Act and federal civil rights law. The letter outlined proposed remedies, immediate granting of my accommodation request with assignment of the closest guest spot as my permanent parking space, refund of all fines and fees I'd incurred, totaling over $800, payment of $10,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress and violation of my civil rights, a 3-year consent decree requiring federal oversight of all HOA policies and decisions, mandatory Fair Housing Act training for all board members, property management staff, and HOA attorneys, implementation of a formal reasonable accommodation request and response process, a civil penalty of $50,000 payable to the United States Treasury. The letter gave the HOA 30 days to agree to the terms or face a federal lawsuit. I called Marcus to share the news. He let out a low whistle. $50,000 in civil penalties plus oversight plus damages. Walt, you broke them. No HOA survives that kind of federal scrutiny. Good. Maybe the next board will think twice before treating people like garbage. That evening I got a knock on my door. I opened it to find 3 of my neighbors, Dorothy Chen, Miguel Rodriguez, and a woman I didn't know well named Jennifer Walsh. Mr. Northrop, Miguel said, we heard about the DOJ letter. We wanted to thank you. What you've done, standing up to them, it's going to help all of us. Dorothy nodded. The board is finished. Half the residents are calling for their resignation. There's going to be a special election. Jennifer spoke up. We're forming a coalition of residents to make sure the new board is accountable and follows the law. We'd like you to consider joining the board yourself. I was taken aback. Me? I'm probably the last person the HOA wants on their board. Exactly, Miguel said. We need people who will stand up for what's right instead of going on power trips. You've proven you'll do that. I told them I'd think about it. After they left, I sat on my couch, looking around my small condo. This place was supposed to be my refuge, my quiet corner to heal and rebuild. Instead, it had become a battleground, but maybe that was the point. Maybe I'd spent so much time trying to get back to normal, to pretend my injuries and my trauma didn't define me, that I'd forgotten what I'd fought for in the first place. Justice. Fairness. The idea that people should be treated with basic human dignity regardless of who they are. 5 days later, the HOA's attorney called me again. Mr. Northrop, my client, is prepared to accept the Dodge's proposed terms. All of them? Yes, all of them. They're also prepared to issue a formal public apology to you and to implement a victim compensation fund for other residents who were improperly fined or penalized due to disabilities or discrimination. What about Brenda Patterson, Mrs. Patterson and 2 other board members have resigned effective immediately. There will be a special election for new board members next month. Additionally, I want you to know that the U.S. Attorney's Office has decided not to pursue criminal charges, largely because the board has agreed to full cooperation and remediation. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of me had wanted to see Brenda face criminal consequences. But another part of me was just tired and ready for this to be over. "I'll agree to the settlement on one condition," I said. "What's that?" "The apology has to be specific. It has to acknowledge that they discriminated against a disabled veteran, that they retaliated against me for asserting my civil rights, and that their actions were morally and legally wrong. No corporate speak, no vague language about misunderstandings. A real apology. I'll draft something and send it to you for approval." 3 days later, I received a proposed apology letter. It was everything I'd asked for and more. The HOA acknowledged their violations, apologized specifically to me and to other disabled residents they'd mistreated, and committed to being a model of fair housing compliance going forward. On October 1st, a community meeting was held at the community center. Every unit was packed. The remaining board members sat at the front table, looking shell-shocked. Richard Stephenson stood at a podium and read the apology aloud to the entire community. When he finished, there was silence. Then Dorothy Chen stood up and started clapping. Others joined in. Within seconds, most of the room was applauding, not for the board, but in acknowledgement that something had fundamentally changed. After the meeting, I was approached by so many people I lost count. Veterans thanking me for standing up for myself. Disabled residents sharing their stories. Parents of children with disabilities expressing relief that the new policies would protect their families. An elderly man with a walker gripped my hand with surprising strength. "My boy served in Iraq. He's got PTSD and a bad back from a convoy accident. He's been thinking about buying a place here. Now I can tell him it's safe to do that. Thank you, son." The special election happened 3 weeks later. I didn't run for the board. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime, but Miguel Rodriguez did, along with Jennifer Walsh and 2 other residents committed to reform. All 4 won by landslide margins. The new board's first act was to officially assign me permanent parking in the guest spot nearest my unit. Their second act was to review every fine issued in the past 5 years and refund those that appeared retaliatory or discriminatory. Over $70,000 in fines were refunded to residents. Their third act was to invite me to help draft new accessibility guidelines for the community to ensure that no one would face what I'd faced ever again. By Thanksgiving, Sunset Ridge felt like a different place. The toxic atmosphere of fear and petty enforcement had been replaced by something that felt almost like actual community. People smiled at each other in the parking lot. Neighbors helped neighbors. The management company had been replaced with one that actually understood customer service. I was taking groceries out of my car one afternoon in early December when a familiar vehicle pulled into the parking lot. It was Marcus, along with his wife and 2 kids. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "We're looking at Unit 189. It just went on the market." "I figured after everything you went through to fix this place, it's probably safe to move here now." I laughed. "You know what? It actually is." Marcus bought the unit. He moved in just after New Year's. Having my old friend as a neighbor, watching his kids play in the common areas, it drove home what this fight had really been about. It wasn't about parking. It was about creating a place where people could actually live, not just exist under the thumb of petty tyrants. The consent decree remained in effect for 3 years. During that time, HUD conducted annual reviews of the HOA's policies and practices. Every review found them in compliance. The required training sessions became opportunities for real education about civil rights and accessibility. Several board members actually told me they were embarrassed by how little they'd understood about the law before this all happened. Brenda Patterson moved out of Sunset Ridge 6 months after the settlement. I heard through the grapevine that she'd bought a house in a different development, one without an HOA. I didn't wish her ill. I just hoped she'd learned something from the experience. As for me, I finally got the quiet refuge I'd been looking for. I continued my physical therapy, worked on my recovery, and eventually started volunteering with a veterans organization that helped newly disabled vets navigate the VA system and find accessible housing. I told my story at one of their workshops, explaining how I'd fought the HOA and won. Afterward, a young Marine who'd lost both legs in a training accident approached me. "Sir, I've been getting harassed by my landlord about having to build a ramp to my apartment. He says it violates the lease. After hearing your story, I think I know what I need to do." I gave him Sharon Valdez's contact information and the number for a legal aid organization that helped disabled veterans. 3 months later, I got an email from him. He'd filed a HUD complaint. His landlord had backed down and built the ramp. He wanted to thank me for showing him that fighting back was possible. That's when I realized this was bigger than just my parking space or my HOA. Every time someone stood up against discrimination, every time someone refused to accept being treated as less than human because of a disability, it made it easier for the next person to do the same. Looking back, I'm grateful for the fight, as exhausting as it was. It taught me that the skills I'd learned in the military, the persistence, the refusal to back down in the face of adversity, those things weren't just useful on a battlefield. They were useful in everyday life, in standing up for what was right even when it was hard. My parking space is still right there, 15 feet from my front door, the guest spot that started this whole thing. Some days I park there and think about everything that happened. The violation notices, the towing, the federal investigations, the fear and the anger and the determination. But mostly I just think about how nice it is to walk 15 feet instead of 100 yards when my leg is hurting, and I'm tired from another VA appointment. I think about Dorothy Chen, who no longer gets fined for accessibility modifications. I think about the families with disabled children who can install ramps and grab bars without fear of retaliation. I think about all the people who will move into Sunset Ridge in the future and never even know this fight happened, who will just assume that, of course, disabled residents are treated fairly, that, of course, reasonable accommodations are granted, that, of course, people's civil rights are respected. That assumption, that basic expectation of decency and fairness, that's what I fought for. And every single day I park in that spot, 15 feet from my door, I know it was worth it. The consent decree ended last month. HUD sent me a letter congratulating me on the successful resolution of my case, and noting that Sunset Ridge had become a model for other HOAs in the region for disability accommodation and fair housing compliance. They even asked if I'd be willing to speak at a conference about my experience. I said yes, because if my story can help one person understand their rights, can give one disabled veteran the courage to stand up to discrimination, can convince one HOA board that people are more important than rules, then everything I went through meant something. I'm Walter Northrop. I'm a disabled veteran, a survivor, and someone who refused to accept injustice when it showed up at my doorstep with an orange violation notice flapping in the Arizona wind. This was my fight, and this is my story. And I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat.